And I'll just wait a few more moments for everyone to get settled. Good morning.
Good morning.
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 Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good morning. I'm Hearing Officer Nicole Kinsey with the Administrative Hearings Office of the State Water Resources Control Board. It is the third day of the rebuttal portion of Phase 1B of the Kern River applications hearing. Today is June 22nd, 2022. I'll do my abbreviated version of our introductions this morning. I will say this hearing is being conducted by Zoom web conference and is also being broadcast live on the AHO YouTube channel. Both the audio and the video are being recorded, and we will post files of that recording on the AHO FTP site. The YouTube recording will also be available on the AHO YouTube webpage. As usual, if any of you are experiencing technical difficulties, please just send an email to the AHO at admin@hrgoffice@waterboards.ca.gov. Assisting me today are the usual staff from the Administrative Hearings Office: Nicole Mullen, Amy Blunk, Skylar Anderson, and Kyle Woldridge. Ms. Mullen will once again be handling the screen sharing of exhibits. So to the witnesses joining us today, please just ask Ms. Mullen to advance the slide when you're ready during your presentation. And as usual, attorneys, you may address Ms. Mullen directly to ask her to bring up a particular exhibit. If at any time I'm experiencing technical difficulties, a member of the AHO staff will call a brief recess until I'm able to rejoin you. We will, as usual, take breaks today. As you've done, please just let me know if you would like a break or need a break. We will take an hour for lunch, and we will once again have a hard stop by 5 p.m. today. I am not going to go through appearances individually, but I will look to the room and ask whether there's anyone joining us today who has not had a chance to introduce themselves, either other than our witnesses, either Monday or Tuesday. Is there anyone new joining us today? Wonderful. I think where we left off, I'll take a brief pause before we jump back into cross-examination. But where we left off, we were in the middle of cross-examination of Mr. O'Brien was cross-examining Dr. Howes, and we called a break because we all needed a good night's sleep and some coffee before we did statistics, which I think was a good choice. But with that, is there anything else procedurally we should address before we get started for the day? Mr. Jacobs.
There is one. I have one procedural matter.
Okay, Mr. Cooney, let me turn to Mr. Jacobs first, and then I'll turn to you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to remind the hearing officer that Ms. Melton has a work conflict today between 1 and 3 p.m. And hopefully we can work around that. I think her testimony is pretty short.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobs, for the reminder. I appreciate that, and we will work around that and accommodate that. Thank you. Mr. Cooney, I will now turn to you.
Yes. So as you know, North Kern has been, and our office has been facilitating the court reporter service, and they've done an excellent job, and we're happy to do that. But one of their protocols is, and we received it here again today, they seek confirmation of services. And so today, this morning, we confirmed services for tomorrow, which we're happy to have done, and we've now done that. But not knowing exactly what the schedule is, I want to make sure that I'm not getting ahead of ourselves. And so maybe at some later in the day kind of discussion we have, but that's just the protocol. And I don't think I had shared that with you as hearing officer of how we do the mechanics.
Thank you, Mr. Cooney. Just to make sure I understand, what you're asking is if a best guess as to whether or not we will proceed through Friday? Is that generally the bottom line?
That's the general sense of it is, yes, because they do a day ahead, of course,
Yeah.
because they need to be able to have their staffing in position. And so I don't want to overcommit to when we don't really need a service of a court reporter. So that's all I'm raising.
Of course. Thank you, Mr. Cooney. I think that's a good point. Let's assess later today and see where we are. The other matter of note, which may motivate all of us, is not that it's a particular matter, but Ms. Mullen won't be able to join us on Friday. So that may, for all of us, we will muddle through without her. But and my team, we do have alternates, but it may help motivate us to try to get this done before Friday. So but thank you, Mr. Cooney. Please don't hesitate to bring this up later if I forget, and we'll try to make a best assessment closer in the afternoon today. Is there anything else?
Sorry, one more thing.
Yes, please, Mr. Jacobs.
We could deal with this later, but we're not sure which version of Mr. Unruh's testimony is at issue. There was a corrected version submitted, but the original version was the subject of your evidentiary ruling.
Yes, and I believe was it Mr. Cooney? Did you raise this issue about
back on the hot seat? Yes, it was me.
Yes, I was. It was not your witness, but you raised the issue, and I haven't gone back to resolve this. So thank you again, Mr. Jacobs. I need to look back at the ruling and the testimony. I suspect that my evidentiary ruling may have been in error and addressed the uncorrected testimony, and I just haven't gotten to that yet because we're not quite there yet. So thank you, and I will address it, and I'll try to do it in more than 5 minutes before Mr. Unruh testifies. So we have some notice. Anything else? All right, I will look to I see Dr. Howes. Good morning, Dr. Howes. Thank you for joining us. Do you recall yesterday when I administered the oath during this hearing?
Yes, I do.
And do you understand that the oath continues to apply to your testimony today?
Yes, I do.
Thank you very much. And with that, I will turn things back to you, Mr. O'Brien. You may proceed with your questions when you're ready.
Ms. Kinsey, before we get started, can I clarify a point that I made yesterday? If that's okay.
Certainly, please go ahead.
In the heat of the discussion, I said the word fabricate, referring to the Ag Commissioner's data pre-1955. Understanding the conditions with, say, World War II and the Great Depression, fabricate was probably too strong of a word to state about that yield data. When you look at the data, they never presented the data in tons per acre. It makes sense. Most of that alfalfa yield would have been actually within the farm. They never would have measured the yield. And so it would have been difficult for the Ag Commissioners to get yield data at that time. So I don't know how they got it, but when you look at the data, it's not in the quality that it's suspect to as true data. So that's all I meant by that.
Thank you, Dr. Howes, for that clarification. And now I will, in fact, turn to you, Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you, Ms. Kinsey. Good morning, Dr. House.
Morning, Mr. O'Brien.
Ms. Mullen, could you pull up Dr. Howe's PowerPoint, which is Buena Vista 1101, and turn to slide 3, please? There we go. Thank you. Dr. Howes, in this slide, you state in part that spatial boundaries for a water balance analysis must be defined. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you also say that these spatial boundaries must be consistent or maintained consistently?
That's right.
And is that those principles are those sort of standard operating principles within the engineering profession?
A water balance, when a water balance is conducted, yes, that's true.
Okay. And then you state there at the bottom in blue, both KWBA experts failed to adhere to or understand water balance fundamentals. Do you see that?
I do.
And when we talk about both KWBA experts, you're talking about Dr. Davids and Ms. Boisevane, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, you testified yesterday that the term zone of influence is the name that you used for purposes of your analysis for the spatial boundary. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And I think you told me at one point it doesn't really matter what you call it, but the important thing is that you have a consistent spatial boundary, correct?
That's correct.
And you described, I think what you referred to as the horizontal spatial boundary that you used for purposes of the water balance analysis in this case. And I just want to make sure I have all of the elements of that horizontal boundary. As I wrote it down, you stated that it starts at Second Point, encompasses the Kern River Channel, all of Buena Vista's distribution channels, including the flood channel canal to Highway 46, Buena Vista Lake, and both service areas, Buttonwillow and Maples. Do I have that right in terms of this horizontal spatial boundary?
Yes, you do. And I didn't clarify distribution channels in which years, but it would have been the distribution channels that Buena Vista has utilized since 1938 throughout the area downstream of Second Point.
So you didn't consider distribution channels utilized by Buena Vista prior to 1938 in your water balance analysis?
I didn't do an analysis prior to 1938, and that's stated in my testimony in case in chief.
Okay. You also said yesterday that additional boundaries, is a term you used, include Lake Isabella plus separately exchanges and transfers. Is that correct?
Well, they are included in this overall boundary of the water balance. That's correct.
Okay. And are they included in this, what you call the horizontal spatial boundary?
They are included. So there's two separate entities. One is the zone of influence that has a standard horizontal boundary. The banking and exchanges and storage and losses in Isabella are additive to the overall boundary condition. That's not necessarily a physical horizontal boundary, but it is what encompasses the water balance area that we're looking at. So because the bankings and exchanges are at a point, a measurement at a point, those wouldn't necessarily have a set boundary. They're added into the overall water balance as it's shown in this figure, where the set boundary is that zone of influence downstream of Second Point. The other areas where water is used by Buena Vista are added into that because they are separate, physically separate from that horizontal boundary.
I want to make sure I understand that. Maybe it would be best to use a concrete example. You're aware, are you not, that Buena Vista regularly transfers water to the Castaic Lake Water Agency?
I am not that familiar with that transfer. That would have shown up in my data, likely as a delivery to Rosedale Rio Bravo for banking for Buena Vista.
Do you know where the water that's transferred to Castaic by Buena Vista and Rosedale Rio Bravo is ultimately used?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Assuming for purposes of my question that Castaic transfer water is used outside of Kern County, in Los Angeles County, would the zone of influence, as you've described it for purposes of your water balance analysis, include those lands in Los Angeles County where the Kern River water is used that is transferred by Buena Vista?
Ms. Kinsey, I object. This is beyond the scope of rebuttal.
I'm overruling the objection. I mean, here's the reason, Mr. Becerra, because I've been thinking this through too, but this is a little, it's more than a little confusing, this understanding of the horizontal boundaries, because I think Dr. Howes raised this as a critique of Ms. Boisovan's analysis, and we're trying to get to the bottom of this. Now, Mr. O'Brien, I'll tell you to be careful. I don't want this to be a backdoor for the questions about the specific transfers, but to the extent you're using this as a concrete example, I think that's fair, and I will allow it. Thank you. Please go ahead, Mr. O'Brien. Or the question stands, but you may need to repeat it.
I'll repeat the question, Dr. House. So assuming for purposes of my question that the water that's transferred by Buena Vista and Rosedale Rio Bravo to the Castaic Water Agency is ultimately used outside Kern County, and let's assume that we're talking just about Kern River water here, and that water is actually used in Los Angeles County. Would your zone of influence, as you've described it, include those areas in Los Angeles County where the Kern River water is used?
Well, obviously not, because I've stated what the actual physical boundaries are, and they are all within Kern County. And I state here clearly that the bankings and transfers are not within that zone of influence. The bankings and transfers are measured outside of that zone of influence. So I don't know. It's very clear in my testimony and in my technical memorandums that the bankings and exchanges, their measurements are outside of the zone of influence. The zone of influence is a hard spatial boundary. I show that boundary in my case in chief, in multiple maps within that case in chief. So we can look at the actual boundary if you'd like to do that too, but it stays within Kern County for the zone of influence. The overall water balance also has to incorporate where other uses are occurring. And some of those uses are outside of the zone of influence, including banking and exchanges, as well as storage and losses in Lake Isabella.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Now, we discussed this concept of a horizontal spatial boundary. Is there also a vertical aspect to the spatial boundary, or the zone of influence, as you call it?
It depends on the type of water balance being conducted, how you would define what that vertical boundary is. In this case, the vertical boundary would be at the bottom of a confining layer and even below that.
And when we talk about the bottom of a confining layer and even below that, you're talking about the aquifers within the Kern subbasin, correct?
Below Buena Vista Water Storage District.
Now, yesterday I asked you how you accounted for water that seeps out of Buena Vista's various facilities into the aquifers within the Kern subbasin. And you told me, quote, "The water that I account for seeps into the canals and makes its way to groundwater aquifers, and where it goes from there, I did not analyze, but it is included in the zone of influence because it is Buena Vista's water." End quote. Did I get that right?
That sounds about like what I said.
Okay. So just so I understand this, as water seeps from the canals into the groundwater aquifers within the Kern subbasin, would you agree that it's likely that some of that subsurface water migrates out from under the lands that are within the current Buena Vista Water Storage District?
Objection calls for speculation.
I'll sustain it. Mr. O'Brien, I've
Okay,
asked the question in a different way.
I'll break it down.
Yeah.
Have you, through your work in this case, done any work relating to the flow of groundwater within the Kern subbasin?
No, I haven't.
Okay. But just so I'm clear on your zone of influence concept, is it fair to say that that concept encompasses the entire let me rephrase it, because I don't want to get back into our aquifer issue here. Does your zone of influence, as used in your water balance analysis, include all of the aquifers underlying the Kern subbasin as defined by the Department of Water Resources? Or is that zone of influence limited to those portions of the aquifers that vertically underlie Buena Vista?
The zone of influence specifically.
Let's start with that, yes.
The zone of influence, it would be the aquifers, and generally the unconfined aquifers, but that I can't say that for a fact because there is some recharge. But the aquifers underlying Buena Vista Water Storage District is where that water, and the zone of influence, which is outside the service area, but still within the zone of influence downstream of Second Point, which would also include West Kern Water District ponds, go into the aquifer that underlie them, which is the same portion of the aquifer as the Kern Water Bank Authority, I believe.
And I apologize if I'm just not tracking with your answers this morning, Dr. House, but I guess I'm still fuzzy on the question of the extent of your zone of influence in relation to groundwater aquifers. And let me ask it this way. If I were to ask you to draw on a map the areas of Kern County that were included in this vertical zone of influence relating to groundwater, how would you go about drawing that? Would it be all of the Kern subbasin, or would it be just the area underlying the Buena Vista Water Storage District?
Technically, it would be where that water could potentially flow out to, given the gradients, because that water, those molecules can leave the boundary, but that doesn't mean that they leave access by Buena Vista and their growers. So I believe we would have to have a more detailed analysis of where that water could go. It wouldn't be all of the Kern subbasin because there are many different types of aquifers within the Kern subbasin. Some are detached, some are overlying, some are confined, and some are unconfined. But it would be a portion where that water could flow into given the gradients that are created due to overpumping in other areas.
But as you sit here today, you have not conducted that further analysis of where the recharged water could go within the Kern subbasin, correct?
That's correct.
Ms. Mullen, if you could pull up Buena Vista 503C. And we're going to go to page 3, please. And again, I'm going to direct your attention, Dr. House, to the second paragraph that begins with the words "in this analysis." I'll let you just take a moment and read that to yourself.
Okay.
Now, you testified yesterday that this term absorption is, and you use the word absolutely, related to the concept of absorption for beneficial use that was used in the staff analysis that was prepared in connection with decision 1196. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And I think you testified that you had some familiarity with that staff analysis, correct?
Limited, but some.
How did you happen to come into possession of that staff analysis?
Objection beyond the scope of rebuttal. Dr. Howe's rebuttal is a critique of other experts.
Well, Mr. O'Brien, where are you going? Why does it matter? Explain to me where you're going with this.
Well, this ties into the discussion we had yesterday. Embedded in Dr. Howe's water balance analysis is this concept of absorption. We saw some of that in the case in chief evidence. We now see more of it in his rebuttal testimony. That ties to the zone of influence concept, which again was both in the case in chief evidence and is now rearing its head again in this rebuttal phase. And my position is that I should be able to question Dr. Howe's about the conceptual foundation for his water balance analysis, which includes this zone of influence concept that we've been discussing, and also includes this concept of absorption. And just to lay my cards on the table, Ms. Kinsey, it's clear to me that what has happened here is Dr. Howe's, either through direction or on his own, has used this concept of absorption for beneficial use that was put forward by the staff at the Division of Water Rights back in the 50s and apparently embraced by the board and its.
So let me stop you right there, Mr. O'Brien. I think all of this you will, I'm sure, clarify for me in closing briefs, and I do understand it. On the issue of absorption, I do think that's fair game. That was not my question. Why does it matter where Dr. House got this? I'm a little bit puzzled with this particular question, which is where he acquired a publicly available document. Where are you going with that question?
Well, I think he got it from Mr. Becerra, and I'd like to ask him that question.
If I may, I've already answered that question in the case in chief cross. You already asked that question. So.
Well, my memory isn't as good as it used to be, Dr. House, and I'm hoping maybe you could just answer it again for me, if Ms. Kinsey will allow it.
I'm going to sustain the objection. Let's move on, Mr. O'Brien, to your next question.
Okay. And I think you testified yesterday, and I want to make sure I have this right in my notes, Dr. House, that you decided to use this term absorption. And what I wrote is that you stated, quote, "It's a term that seemed to have already been used for the Kern River so it seemed like it fit here for this analysis, end quote. Is that a correct statement of your testimony?
I believe so.
Okay. So you basically saw that term absorption had been used in the staff analysis relating to decision 1196, and you carried it forward into your current analysis, correct?
That's, it felt like a term that, yeah, I can't disagree with that assessment. It is just a term. I've defined what that is in detail in my case in chief. And so I think that should answer it.
Okay, thank you. All right, Ms. Mullen, if we could pull up Buena Vista 1102, PDF page 4. And if you could scroll down just a bit, Ms. Mullen. You make the statement just under that heading, assumption that yield was lower in earlier years is wrong. You make the statement that Dr. Davids used statistics improperly to estimate alfalfa yield in 1914. Do you see that?
Which line are you on?
It's right after the heading. It's right at the bottom of the page on my screen.
I just see one sentence there. You scroll a little bit. I see that Dr. Davids used statistics improperly to estimate alfalfa yield in 1914. I see that.
Yes. And one of the bases for your statement that he used statistics improperly was that you believe, and this is reflected in the second bullet point, that it is improper to extrapolate from a regression without a strong physical reason as well as strong statistical results, correct?
That's correct.
Ms. Mullen, could we pull up Buena Vista 1104? Dr. House, this is a document that you utilized in connection with your rebuttal testimony, correct?
That's correct.
And it's a reliable document?
I believe so.
And one of the points that's made, if we could scroll down, Ms. Mullen. One of the points that's made in this paper is that you have to be careful about extrapolations. And I found the example, if we could scroll down just a little further, that's the last paragraph on that first page, starting with the words "now consider," and it has a simple hypothetical, but I think it's illustrative, and it's illustrated in Figure 1. It says that Figure 1 is a hypothetical plot of age in years versus height in inches for a randomly selected sample of boys aged 8 to 14. Within the range of the data, a linear relationship appears to provide a reasonable fit. The fitted line is then used to estimate height at age 50. The resulting extrapolation indicates that men at age 50 are, on the average, over 10 feet tall. To my non-mathematical mind, that was a helpful example of why you have to be careful with extrapolation based on linear regressions. Would you agree with that?
I would.
Okay. Now, if we could turn to the last page of the document. It's document page 165, and I'm not sure what the PDF page is.
It's going to be 7. Yeah.
There we go. Thank you. And that under the heading conclusion, Hahn states that extrapolation beyond the range of the given data is required in many practical problems. The purpose of this article is not to condemn such extrapolation, but merely to emphasize the resulting hazards. He goes on to state, just because a particular form of relationship appears to provide a reasonable fit to the given data does not mean that the relationship holds beyond the data range. Extrapolation thus needs to be justified from physical and not purely statistical considerations. I'll stop there. Actually, I'd like to read the next sentence as well. When an inference requires extrapolation beyond the range of the given data, this should be clearly stated in the extent of extrapolation indicated. First of all, do you agree with that portion of the Hahn paper that I just read?
I would include that next sentence in parentheses. But yes, I did.
Okay.
I've actually.
Fair enough. Let's just, so the record's clear, that sentence states, in general, a little extrapolation is less dangerous than a lot of extrapolation.
I do, and I've actually quoted a portion of that in my rebuttal testimony.
Okay. Would you agree that there is no reliable data on alfalfa yield within Buena Vista prior to 1930?
Nothing that I have found.
Okay. Would you also agree that there's no reliable data on alfalfa yield within Kern County prior to 1930?
I would agree with that, and probably before that period too, other than what we have for Buena Vista that I've found.
Now, the Hahn paper that we just read talked about physical factors. What are the types of physical factors you would want to consider in relation to alfalfa yield in determining the validity of a particular extrapolation, just in general terms?
I have a number of those, but isn't that something you were supposed to, your experts were supposed to present?
I'm going to move to strike that. Ms. Kenzie, that's not responsive to my question, and it's argumentative.
Well, I'll just strike it as non-responsive. Dr. Howes, if you would, I can ask Mr. O'Brien to repeat the question, or you may ask him. But you can, I mean, you have a range of responses. You can provide your own answer. You can say, I don't know, etc.
So can you repeat the question?
Sure. We reviewed this passage from the Hahn paper under the heading conclusion, and it talks in part about physical factors. And my question, sir, is in considering the validity of an extrapolation relating to alfalfa yields within Buena Vista, what are the physical factors that you would want to consider in evaluating that extrapolation? And I realize this is a general question in the abstract. I'm just trying to get an understanding of your understanding of what physical factors are relevant.
I'm going to object as vague and ambiguous because we're mixing and matching Kern County versus Buena Vista. Mr. O'Brien said Buena Vista.
Yeah,
That's it.
I
That's it.
made my question more precise.
Okay, thank you.
What physical factors would I consider to attempt to extrapolate downward the yield in 1914 from data available from 1930 to 1990?
Yes.
But I wouldn't extrapolate back in time past data that I have hard data for. There's no physical reason that I can see that the yield would have been less before 1930 than it was at 1930 or 31, 32, 33, 34. So I can see no justification for extrapolation back in time. If you want to talk in generalities, say statewide, I'd be happy to do that.
I think you've answered my question. Ms. Mullen, if you could pull up KWBA Cross Exhibit 426. If you could scroll down, Ms. Mullen, this is a document authored by Warren E. Johnston. You know Professor Johnston?
I do not know Professor Johnston.
You're not aware that he's a noted agriculture economist at UC Davis?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Let's go to page 8 of the document, which I believe is PDF page 11. And I'd like you to, if you could scroll down just a bit more, Ms. Mullen. This, first of all, have you ever seen this document before?
No, I haven't.
Okay. In connection with your work in this case, did you survey the academic literature on trends in alfalfa yields over time?
I have, to a certain degree.
But you never saw this paper?
No.
Is the graph that we're looking at, which is the second graph from the top on PDF page 11, is that representative of your general understanding of the long-term trends in alfalfa yield in California?
Yep. Yes, it is.
And that second graph shows an increase in alfalfa yield from just over 4 tons per acre to just under 7 tons per acre from 1945 to 1990. Is that correct?
That's what it shows.
Okay. If we could scroll to the next page, Ms. Mullen, PDF page 12. And I'd like to call your attention to the paragraph that begins with the word dramatically.
Mhm.
And I'll read the relevant portion. It says dramatically increased yields, parentheses, figure 1.2b, close parentheses, are substantially due to the development of pest and disease resistant varieties. In the mid 1950s, for example, the spotted alfalfa aphid was devastating to alfalfa hay production. New Resistant varieties were developed that entirely replaced types formerly planted, and average yields increased into the early 1960s. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, yields continued to increase as further improved varieties were adopted and better management practices, including proper irrigation techniques, became more widely adopted by producers. Current research focuses on water conservation technology and management and the development of new varieties to make better use of winter growing periods. Is that paragraph that I just read consistent with your knowledge and understanding of trends in alfalfa yields in California and the reasons relating to those trends?
I think it's lacking, but that's because it's an economist and not an agronomist writing it. But from the mid 1950s or post World War II to the early, let's say, 1960s and 70s, I would say that this had some impact of it. Obviously, we're not talking about this period of time, but if you were looking to, let's say, extrapolate from data from 1955 to 1945, this could be a physical reason to do that, to answer your earlier question, or a reason, but it doesn't have anything to do with anything that happened prior to 1930, specifically because they only went back to 1945 here. But again, there's a variety of other factors that are not described in that paragraph that would have impacted the alfalfa hay yield in California on a per acre basis over time.
What are those other factors?
Well, there's a lot of intermountain alfalfa in the early 1900s. A lot of it would be rain-fed. You see over time more of it coming into the Central Valley. The Imperial Valley of California also has its high yields. The soils are actually very similar in Imperial as they are in the temperatures, for that matter, in some cases, as they are in Buena Vista. So seeing the high yields in the 1930s presented in the Stanton report comparatively to trends over California as a whole, you can see that there was higher yields in Buena Vista and the surrounding areas of that area than there were even in other areas of Kern County likely. So we're looking at rain-fed moving into irrigated, and so that's going to have a huge increase in overall alfalfa production. It's obviously not the case in Buena Vista, which was already irrigated, but when you're looking statewide, we see a trend moving away from intermountain alfalfa into valley-grown Mediterranean climate alfalfa, more irrigation, more harvest, therefore more harvestability, better growing practices, things of that nature.
Thank you. Ms. Mullen, if you could pull up KWVA Cross Exhibit 427. And just so that, I guess first question, Dr. House, is, are you familiar with this document?
It looks familiar. At least I believe I am, yes.
Okay. If you could, Ms. Mullen, turn to PDF page 2. We're going to look at figure 3. What's your understanding of or what's your interpretation of this figure 3, Dr. House?
It looks just like an expansion of the figure we previously looked at in terms of alfalfa hay yield in California versus year. Since in this case, they went back to the 1920s and then expanded it past 1990 into the 2000s.
But just like the other figure in Professor Johnston's paper, this shows a long-term trend of increasing alfalfa yield in California, correct?
That's correct.
Now, looking at the text under the heading yield, the paper states alfalfa hay yield increased almost linearly from 1920, when about 3.5 tons per acre were harvested, to the early 1990s, when average yield reached 7 tons per acre. Since then, the yield has stabilized. The yield increase was the result of crop breeding, which led to pest and disease resistant varieties and improved management practices such as irrigation techniques. Do you agree with that statement?
No, it's not complete.
And how would you augment it so that it were complete?
I think it's more clearly presented in, I think it's alfalfa irrigation management in the Mediterranean climates, but there were a variety of factors. The most notable is the movement away from rain-fed pasture alfalfa in intermountain regions to more intensive agriculture irrigated alfalfa growing in areas like Buena Vista or similar to that, like the Imperial Valley of California and Kern, Tulare counties, Kings counties, as the cattle production increased through time as well. So we see alfalfa throughout California. Notably, even the 1930s, we have alfalfa yields at 8 tons per acre in Buena Vista. So comparing that to even what the yields show in California today, show that there's a substantial difference statewide as there would have been in Buena Vista.
Ms. Mullen, if you could now pull up Buena Vista 1102, and we're going to go to document page 4. If you could scroll up just a bit. Thank you, Ms. Mullen. A little bit more. Thank you. I'd like to focus your attention, Dr. Howes, on the text that starts with the words "a defensible process." Do you see that on the 3rd line?
I do.
When you state a defensible process would have been to use the ITRC-metric data to calibrate a daily soil water balance model that models the actual growth and management of each crop in BVWSD, and then to adjust the model for changes in this management over time, end quote. The ITRC metric data that you reference in that sentence is from what time period?
I believe it's 2017 through 2019. I might be off by a year there, but that's my understanding. Well, that's what they used. I would have used more data.
Well, but I'm trying to understand, you're saying here that Dr. Davids and Ms. Boisevane, presumably mostly Dr. Davids, should have used this, what you call defensible process, correct?
That's correct.
And I'm trying to understand the data set, the time frame in the data set. You're saying they should have used this ITRC metric data set. So that's my question. What is the time frame of the data set that you think Dr. Davids should have used?
The more, the better. Ideally, 1992 through 2021. Although if it has to be a little less, then if you have somebody that actually knows what they're doing, understands the cropping patterns, understands evapotranspiration, you can get by with a calibration data set that's less than that. I would prefer a calibration set for this defensible model to be at least 5 years of data, although that ideally it'd be 10, but you can get by perhaps with 3. That would have been a more, at least the process overall with the daily soil water balance model that's calibrated, understanding the crops that are being grown, understanding the management of those crops. That is what's important here. The data set for ITRC metric, even if there was 3 years, that it's defensible. It's not ideal, but it's defensible. But simply going back in time because you think the yield was lower pre-1914 or in 1914 than it is in 1955, that's not defensible.
I'm going to move to strike the last part of the answer, starting with the words, but going back in time. That was not the subject of my question.
Overruled, Mr. O'Brien. I think that it was sufficiently related to the question. So I'm going to, we'll maintain that testimony.
Dr. Howes, I'm not sure I've gotten an answer to my question. You talk about a defensible process would have been to use the ITRC metric data. And you're familiar with the ITRC metric data, correct?
I generate the ITRC metric data. I've developed the model and the process.
Yes, congratulations. So my question is, if you were king and you could run this analysis any way you wanted using the ITRC metric data, what data set would you use?
I would use 1992 through 2020 monthly evapotranspiration data.
Thank you. And this ITRC metric data that you reference in this document, is that model data or is that observed data?
It is computed data from observed measurements from Landsat as well as ground-based weather stations.
But it's generated by a model.
It's generated by a process. The model, I wouldn't call it necessarily a model because it's not necessarily that we're predicting, but we are using measured data to generate evapotranspiration data using a surface energy balance. So it's a physically based process.
Well, when you say physically based, all models are calibrated in relation to observed data in one form or another, aren't they?
We would hope so, but I wouldn't say they all are.
Well, fair enough. Well, I think I'm ready to move on from that particular topic. With respect to the relationship between evapotranspiration and yield, as a general proposition, do healthy plants, and again, we're talking about alfalfa, tend to produce higher yields than unhealthy plants?
Just to confirm, because I kind of missed that question you asked, do healthy plants produce a higher yield than unhealthy plants?
Yes.
I don't want to sound snarky on this at all, but to me, I'm heavily involved in this area, so it's not a very clear question. I'm gonna kind of help you out here, and not considering quality, say wine grape quality, for example. If we just look at a generality of crops like lettuce, for example, yes, a healthier lettuce plant will generate a higher yield.
And I appreciate you're trying to help me formulate my question, Dr. Howes. But I want to focus on alfalfa.
Okay.
And again, I use the word healthy. That may be a layman's version, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is the relationship between the health of the alfalfa plant and the yield that the plant generates. And if you could just explain that to me.
Objection, vague and ambiguous.
It is vague because we're trying to, I'm thinking, I'm a layperson when it comes to these things too. So I'm thinking healthy, what you could say, well, healthy, it's by definition is the yield, the amount of the yield, or you could say healthy is a lack of pests but maybe what the best way to get into this is Dr. Howes, who is an expert in the field, can explain what he means. So I'm going to overrule the objection, Mr. Becerra, but let's try to work through this together. Dr. Howes, please answer the question, but you have room for qualifying your answer to try to explain this to me.
Thank you, Ms. Kinsey. There's a variety of the term health can go in a variety of ways. There are pests both above and below ground, lack of nutrients, excessive nutrients in some cases, salt issues, water stress, and so typically, if there are issues related to negative issues related to those, we could say that the unhealthy plant, and then the yield would likely be lower in those cases.
Thank you. Ms. Mullen, if we could now pull up Buena Vista 1102, PDF page 3. We're going to look at the second to the last paragraph. Starting with the word however, which is about halfway down that paragraph, Dr. Howes.
Okay.
You state, quote, however, because BVWSD is in a relatively small area and the air temperature, relative humidity, solar radiation, and wind are almost identical, computations of evapotranspiration spatially throughout the district were not warranted, and randomly varying crop pixels was illogical. Do you see that?
I do.
You don't mention soil properties in that statement. Would you agree that soil properties vary within Buena Vista's service area?
Not very much.
What? I'm sorry.
I think we've seen it in a number of presentations, both in case in chief, well, at least in case in chief, where there are fairly similar soil types in Buena Vista's Buttonwillow service area.
When you make that statement, are you basing that on any analysis of soil types or soil properties that you personally did, or are you just reflecting what you've heard in this hearing?
Well, I've seen the soils maps that were presented, and I understand soils maps. So I would say that it's not more than what I've heard, but I haven't gone out and done a complete soil survey, if you will, of Buttonwillow service area.
Okay. You know whether Buena Vista has ever done a survey of that type?
I'm not aware of that. I don't know.
Okay. Ms. Mullen, I'd like to turn back to Dr. Howe's technical memorandum, Buena Vista 1105.
And Mr. O'Brien, since we're going to move to a different exhibit, can you give me, I'm looking for a good time to take a break, and I'm also wondering about an estimate of how much time you anticipate for additional cross.
This would be a good time to take a break, and I would say 45 minutes to an hour.
Okay, thank you, Mr. O'Brien. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. We'll return back at 10:18. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back. I apologize. I was looking at a different clock. 2 minutes off. Needs to be recalibrated. With that, I think we will step back where we were. I will hand things over back to you, Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you, Ms. Kinsey. And speaking of apologies, in our testimony this morning, Dr. House made a reference to the data that he has developed in his work at ITRC, the ITRC metric data. And I made what I can only characterize as a snarky remark. And I want to apologize to Dr. House for that, and to the hearing officer, and to the other counsel. I have great respect for ITRC. I've worked with them on various matters, and did not want to leave that out there. So,
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien.
O'Brien. Thank you.
Thank you.
all right, let's turn to Buena Vista 1105. Ms. Mullen. This is the technical memorandum you prepared, correct, Dr. House?
Yes, it is. One of them.
One of them, yes. And I'd like to focus your attention on, I think it's the language that's actually in bold at the bottom of this first paragraph, where you state, as explained below, when these errors are corrected, application of Dr. David's analytical framework produces a 1914 era wet year appropriation range under the second point right of 566,000 to 605,000 acre feet. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And when you use the term appropriation range in that sentence, what exactly do you mean?
The appropriation range is the amount of water that, because as I use and describe in this memorandum and in my testimony, Dr. Davids was really attempting to back into theoretically what was going on in the zone of influence boundary. The appropriations are, because it's 1914, they would have included the water that was needed in the zone of influence. It really using 1914 as a proxy year for the 1914 era on a upper range, typical wet year or upper range time frame. Water year type, I should say.
Now, Ms. Mullen, if we could scroll to the next page. Page 2, the last paragraph. You state that reservoir losses and change in reservoir storage are shown directly in Exhibit KWBA 014, Table 26 for March 1, 1914 through February 28, 1915. Those values are used directly in Table 1. They may understate actual reservoir losses and changes in reservoir storage before 1914 because Exhibit KWBA 014 apostrophe S Table 26 does not cover all pre-1914 years when storage at Buena Vista Lake Reservoir occurred. Do you see that?
I do.
And we can certainly pull up KWBA 014 Table 26. Do you happen to recall offhand what that is?
There's so many names on the reports. I can't remember exactly which one that is called.
That's perfectly fair. Ms. Mullen, if we could pull up KWBA 014. And maybe scroll to the next page, the cover. One more. Keep scrolling, please. There we go. So this is bulletin 9 that we talked about quite a bit in this hearing.
Yeah.
And let's go to table 26, which I think is at PDF page 72, Ms. Mullen. Is it your understanding, Dr. Howes, that the data presented in this table is annual data?
It is irrigation season data. If you look at the upper left-hand column, it tells you the season, and then I think all but the first line and the last line, perhaps, would cover an annual period of time. Yes.
Okay. And Dr. Davids, in his case in chief analysis, used a monthly time step. Is that your understanding?
Objection,
is-
vague and ambiguous as to time step of what?
Okay, that's a fair objection. I'll make it more precise. In his case in chief analysis of historical Kern River water use on lands within Buena Vista service area, would you agree that Dr. Davids used a monthly time step for his quantitative analysis?
I would agree that he used the monthly time step for at least a portion of his analysis.
Okay, fair enough. Now going back to your technical memorandum, Buena Vista 1105, PDF page 3, table 1. Thank you, Ms. Mullen. You calculate and present in this table a change in reservoir storage of 148,000 acre feet for 1914, correct?
Using 1914 as a proxy year, given the data in table 26, the beginning of the season to the end of the season that was listed there, if you do that math, it was approximately 148,000 acre feet.
When we use the term proxy year, what do you mean by that?
I mean it as an example, basically. I shouldn't say an example. It's a year that can be used as a certain example, I guess is lack of a better term, of what's going on in these types of years. We had data specifically from Dr. Davids for evapotranspiration of applied water for that year. I didn't have a range of years. And additionally, if you're looking at an upper range, certain aspects would not be analyzed over a monthly time step, if you will. You would want to use, when we say something like a maximum year or a typical wet year, that discrete period of time doesn't necessarily have to have a year associated with it. So that's what it means by 1914 as a proxy year. I use data that was presented by Dr. Davids from 1914, presented in the reservoir change and storage and reservoir losses from 1914. And because that happened to be a wet year then I'm using that as a proxy, typical wet year during that era, if you will.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Mullen, if we can now pull up Buena Vista 1102. And I'd like to go to page 2 of the document. And I believe there's some text below the graphic. Yes. Why don't you go ahead and read that paragraph that begins with Dr. David's, Dr. House.
Okay.
So what you're saying in that paragraph, as I understand it, is that Dr. David's attempted to estimate the upper range of 1914 demand in what is now Buena Vista by estimating components within the blue box in your figure above, titled zone of influence / control, but he did not examine entitlement or actual flows into the boundary. He only attempted to estimate the upper range. Is that your testimony?
He did not have actual inflow data that I'm aware of or that he presented. So he used a theoretical methodology to estimate certain components, I should say, within the zone of influence.
And would you agree that entitlement or actual flows into the boundary data regarding those elements is not available?
You mean in 1914?
Yes, thank you.
Not that I've seen. I have not seen any. Okay. I'm not aware of any.
Now I'd like to ask Ms. Mullen to pull up Buena Vista 663, which is the 1927 Buena Vista District Plan, sometimes referred to as the Hammett Report or the Hyatt Report. First of all, Dr. House, have you seen this document before?
I don't remember off the top of my head. I may have. I've read a lot of reports, so I'm unsure.
Okay. And if we could turn to PDF page 10, Ms. Mullen. Under the heading water supply. The text states the amount of second point water available during a cycle of years similar to those of the period of record from 1894 to 1926, inclusive under the Miller-Hagen agreement, would be as follows. And if we could scroll down, Ms. Mullen. And then there's some data presented there at the top of the next page. My question, Dr. House, is do you have any reason to dispute the accuracy of any of the numbers set forth in that table?
Objection beyond the scope of the rebuttal. We went from what Dr. Davids considered to now whether Dr. Howes did.
Brian, you can respond if you'd like.
Well, I guess I'm attempting to get at the underpinnings of his criticism of Dr. Davids for not looking at actual entitlements and flows. And this is an important document in the historical record that even Dr. Littlefield testified was a reliable document. And it's clearly relevant to the question of pre-1914 entitlements and water conditions. And I'm just trying to understand whether there's anything in this document that Dr. Howes has any basis for disputing. And if the answer is no, we can move on.
And in some way, and maybe I'm just not following. So, Mr. O'Brien, and maybe it may not matter what your objective is here, but you're questioning Dr. Howes about the accuracy or his understanding of the accuracy of data that he did not rely upon, nor your expert relied upon. Is that what is happening here? I'm a little confused.
Well, I wouldn't tell you what, I will move on. I think the document speaks for itself. It's in the record, and we can make whatever arguments we decide to make. Thank you. If we could, Ms. Mullen, pull up Buena Vista 1103 again. This, Dr. Howes, is one of your technical memorandums. This is the one that rebuts the testimony of Ms. Boissevain. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Turning to page 2, at the bottom of the page, that's great, Ms. Mullen. The underscored text states, based on my professional judgment, the common issues with Ms. Boissevain's analysis include, and then you list several factors there. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And looking at number 4, you say seepage resulting in BVWSD recharge in the flood channel canal was not included in any year's calculations, even though they are part of BVWSD's total appropriations. Do you see that?
I do.
Now, to reach the flood control channel, water flows over the concrete weir. Is that your understanding?
I'm sorry, I think I missed part of that. Did you?
Yes. So to get water into the flood channel canal, water must first flow over what's been called the concrete weir. Is that correct?
That's correct, which depends on the time frame. But if you look at my case in chief, that weir has moved over time. But in reality, if it passes over either one, it goes into the flood channel canal.
Okay. And once the water gets into the flood channel canal, it flows north approximately 20 miles or so to Highway 46. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the flood channel canal is located west of Buena Vista's Buttonwillow service area, correct?
It's on the western side of it, yes.
And let's turn now, Ms. Mullen, to page 5 of Buena Vista 1103. And there's a table that compares your calculations with Ms. Boissevain's calculations for, I believe, 2011. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Why did you choose 2011?
Oh, well, all of these have direct comparisons for every year that we had, that Ms. Boissevain analyzed. And that we had direct comparative analysis. I analyzed more years in my case in chief, as I'm sure you're aware. All of these, as you'll go, I'm sure you've gone through, all of the years that were selected were years that we both had data that could be compared side by side.
Okay. And there's a row about halfway down, flood channel seepage. You may have to go down a bit, Ms. Mullen.
Flood channel seepage, are you looking, Mr. O'Brien? It's under first set of corrections. It's right in the middle of the page.
There it is. Thank you. And you add 7,792 acre feet of flood channel canal seepage to Ms. Boissevain's calculations that are based on computations that were set forth in Buena Vista 503C. Is that correct?
That's correct.
If we could now go to Buena Vista 503C, Ms. Mullen, PDF page 40. This attachment A explains how you calculated recharge from the flood channel canal. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
I'd like to focus your attention on the fourth sentence. You state that BVWSD staff and their experience managing flood flows through the flood channel canal estimate that flows up to at least 50 CFS will seep from the canal before it moves past Highway 46 and out of the district. Do you see that?
I do.
And you relied on estimates that were provided by Buena Vista staff to estimate recharge from the flood channel canal. Is that correct?
If I'll be allowed to, this document this attachment explains that was the starting point, and then I verified that by looking at aerial photography during a certain period of time that confirmed that at least 37 CFS did not make it past a highway that's only a third of the distance from the concrete weir to Highway 46. So that 50 CFS seemed like a reasonable estimate and is generally considered a conservatively low estimate of what the seepage would be.
Okay. And you estimated seepage from the flood channel canal going as far back as 1952, is that correct?
1938.
38. Are you aware of any evidence that Buena Vista was using the flood channel canal for recharge purposes in 1938?
would have to look at the records, but I believe that in the 1938 documents I presented, that was part of the case in chief, that there may have been a notation of seepage in the flood channel, but I'd have to verify that.
Okay, as you sit here today, you can't say for certain that Buena Vista was using the flood channel canal for recharge purposes in 1938.
I'd have to verify it. Seepage and recharge purposes are often misleading in terms of how we analyze that. Just because a canal flows and seeps, that water does recharge. So the canal flowing and seeping, it is recharging into the groundwater aquifer below Buena Vista, and is available for their farmers to utilize.
But you have not conducted an in-depth analysis of the operations of the flood channel canal as of 1938, correct?
A detailed analysis. Can you explain what you mean by
Well,
that? I know that the water was put into the flood channel canal.
Well, I mean, have you looked at data that would tell you how much water and when it was put into the flood channel canal during that period, 1938?
Section beyond the scope of the rebuttal.
I think this is, I'm going to call this sufficiently related to the discussion about seepage. I'll allow this. I realize it's an exploration of some extent Buena Vista's intent, but I'll allow the question. Go ahead, Dr. House.
Oh, I'm a little confused by the question because I have analyzed when and how much they've put into the flood channel canal in terms of flows over the concrete weir, at least on a monthly basis from 1938 in all of the years that I presented in the case in chief. So I think that answers your question, Mr. O'Brien.
It does. Thank you. That concludes my cross-examination.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. I think I asked this yesterday, but I'll turn to the room again. Does anyone else have cross-examination questions for Dr. Howes? All right, I think before I turn back to you, Mr. Becerra, I believe I may have some questions for Dr. Howes. So let me flip through my notes here, excuse me. So I did have one question, Dr. Howes, about, and we're going back to, just to make sure I understand your testimony and your use of the term absorption for beneficial use. I don't mean to over focus on this. I believe this appears in the, am I correct, in 503C in that technical memo? Is that accurate? Or I'm looking to Mr. Becerra and Mr. O'Brien. Can we get the right exhibit?
Ms. Kinsey, 50C, Buena Vista 50C3. I mixed it up again.
Isn't it? It's like the tax code. It is like the tax code. Yes.
It's too close to the tax code. 503C.
Yes, please. Ms. Mullen, can we pull up 503C and then I will look again to the, can one of you remind me please of the correct page number?
I believe it's page 3 of the document, Ms. Kinsey.
Thank you.
And there's also a discussion of this absorption concept on page 17 of the document.
Thank you. Is it page 17? I believe at some point there, is there a specific, and maybe Dr. Howes, you can help, whether in your testimony you specifically use the term absorption for beneficial use, or do you just use the term absorption?
I believe I just used the term absorption.
Okay.
I think I have, so there's 2 points, right? There's this absorption within the zone of influence, there's Lake Isabella and the exchanges. And so I accounted for those separately, and then combining them, I use the term appropriations under one of us, the second point, right? In discussing that appropriation, I state in the testimony that Buena Vista intends to use that either in this particular year for farmers' beneficial use, so the farmers within Buena Vista's beneficial use through irrigation, or subsequent years, it's managed so that in subsequent years it will be put to beneficial use by the Buena Vista Water Storage District farmers. And so I don't believe I used the term exactly absorption for beneficial use. It is a component of the overall appropriations, which I do term, or I state in my expert opinion on that will be put towards beneficial use, or is intended towards beneficial use by Buena Vista farmers.
Thank you, Dr. Howes. This is helpful. So here's where I'm going with this question, and Mr. Becerra, you are certainly welcome to help me clarify this question or raise friendly, we'll call them friendly objections to the question.
Clarification.
Clarification, thank you. What I'm trying to get at, I just want to confirm with you, Dr. Howes, that your analysis and your use of the term absorption, and then what you've described now as appropriations, I believe under the second point, right? I believe those are your words. In that analysis, did you consider whether or not the uses, the use of the water was beneficial either under the law or as you understand the term beneficial?
Ms. Kinsey, if I might suggest.
Yes, please.
Dr. Howes' opening case in chief testimony, Buena Vista 500C in paragraph 5 states how we use the term appropriation. That may be helpful to you.
Good. Please, can we go there? Exhibit 500C, Ms. Mullen, if you would, please. And then can you, Mr. Becerra, do you have you may have said this, is there a paragraph you can guide us to?
PDF page 3, paragraph 5.
And excuse me while I'm reading the paragraph, so thank you for your patience. So thank you, Mr. Becerra. This brings me to my next question. I just want to understand, Dr. Howes, did you investigate when you talk here about water delivered to farmers or managed in a way to support beneficial use by farmers for irrigation? Did you investigate in any way? Well, let me back up. Let me phrase this again. Your analysis of water, second point water that Buena Vista appropriated includes water that evaporated due to management for beneficial use by farmers. Is that accurate?
Oh, evaporated from someplace specifically?
Evaporated from let's say the canal, the delivery canals. If water was turned into the canals for delivery to the farmers, and then some amount of that water evaporated, that would be included in the totals that you analyze as second point water that Buena Vista appropriated. Is that
So
correct?
that is correct. If I can explain
Please,
a little
please.
bit on, as it states here, that water was put towards a beneficial use. The ultimate destination of that is whether or not that's beneficial or not. We know that that can vary, and it doesn't necessarily matter, because there's another term that comes after put towards beneficial use that you can look at that answers that portion of that question. But I did do an analysis to ensure that my statement here was correct, that the water was put towards a beneficial use, and it is my belief that that intent starts in Lake Isabella and above. It really depends on the year. It's either at First Point or above Isabella, depending on where that measurement's initially taken. Where that goes, I still believe the intent is towards a beneficial use, and I think I'll leave it at that. If you have more questions, do you want
Yes.
more in-depth analysis or assessments, I'm happy to provide that.
And doctors, I don't mean, none of this is intended to be in any way, I'm not trying to trip you up at all. I am just trying to understand the scope of your testimony and how I can appropriately rely, the extent of how I, in making a recommendation to the board, should rely on it. So this next question, I'm going to encourage you, Mr. Becerra, to step in for clarification. I think you'll understand where I'm going, and I don't intend it as a trick question. I'm going to ask about drowning gophers. Okay, so
Sure.
I understand why you were asking that question.
okay, so this and Dr. Howes, I'm going to ask a question about drowning gophers, and the reason for that is because it's just the one example that I can think of where a California court has determined that a use was not beneficial, even though there might be some apparently beneficial aspects to that use of water. And I'm not meaning to suggest, I have no reason to believe that any farmers in Buena Vista are just using water to drown gophers. But the question is, if you were aware, so it's a bit of a hypothetical, Dr. Howes, if you had been aware that some farmers or users of water delivered under the allegedly delivered under the second point right was turned into fields for the sole purpose of drowning gophers, and then that water seeped into the ground and maybe some of that water evaporated, would that potentially have changed your analysis, if to the extent that may not have been a beneficial use? Would that be something you might have considered, or you just don't know because that wasn't the present, these were not the facts presented to you?
Well, let me back up
Please.
a little bit.
Yep.
I interviewed farmers in the area, in Buena Vista specifically. I've interviewed farmers outside of that area. I grew up not too far from that area on a farm. So having experience with Buena Vista, I have not seen anyone drowning gophers, and I know that's a hypothetical.
Right.
But I have no experience or evidence to suggest that anything that wouldn't be considered a beneficial use. And I'm an irrigation expert. I'm an irrigation engineer, water engineer. There are things that are considered a beneficial use by the state that I, as an engineer, would not necessarily consider a beneficial use. So, and not speaking irrigation, but more on how things go with maybe environmental concerns, and I understand them, but there's a difference in my perspective of things too. So I have not seen or have any evidence of any non-beneficial use that was outside of the intent of Buena Vista to deliver, or the farmers to utilize the irrigation water in Buena Vista to deliver that irrigation water and use for a beneficial use. There are a variety of beneficial uses, including salinity leaching, land preparation before, and now going to the, and it probably is on a tangent, but in certain areas, there's been an influx of drip irrigation on alfalfa, in which case one of the main, if you will, constraints on drip irrigation on alfalfa is gophers. So in some cases, you might have a case where an irrigation event, a surface irrigation event on alfalfa is used, even though there's drip, simply to drown the gophers. I would believe that would be a beneficial use of that in order to deal with the gophers, at least for a short period of time. That water would be utilized by the crop, obviously, as well. So that would be an intent, but or a beneficial use where drowning gophers was involved, anyways.
Thank you, Dr. House. That was, I think I should clarify. I think the case involved flood irrigation to drown gophers. So I think this certainly makes a distinction there, which is perceptive. Thank you. I do appreciate that. I think that answers my question on that topic, and I appreciate it. I wanted another follow-up question with respect, and once again, this is my attempt inartfully to try to make sure I understand your testimony and how I can act accurately, the extent to which I can rely on it in certain ways. And I wanted you to clarify for me in your words and describe to me, you engaged in these corrections to Dr. David's methodology and inputs to those methodologies to estimate an upper range of I'm going to be subject to a vague and ambiguous objection here, but I'll call it absorption within Buena Vista's zone of influence and related. Once you made those corrections, do you think that, in your expert opinion, that the methodology with the corrections produces an accurate upper range estimate?
Interesting question, Ms. Kinsey. I noticed that it wasn't asked that earlier. It's a good question. I want to back up a moment because I've tried to explain it in my testimony, but I don't know if it's clear or not, and I just want to make sure that it is clear. There is a different way of analyzing information from a water balance, looking at an average, even if it's quote unquote an upper range average, than a discrete year. And so if you were to compare, for example, an average upper range, you would want to compare that with the average entitlement over a period of time, a similar period of time over a longer period of time. And you wouldn't want to compare the average to, let's say, a maximum appropriation. So one of the aspects that I did with the correction was to define the time frame that Dr. Davids analyzed the data. Well, he analyzed it over a long period of time, but when you present the data, is it an average or is it a maximum discrete year? So in my analysis or my correction to his work, I defined it as a discrete year, and thereby you're looking at the change in storage over that time frame, and that's why that's added in there. If you were to again look at the average, you wouldn't have to look at the change in storage necessarily, because the high years are used when it's dry the next year or a couple of years, and you understand that. But you need to compare apples to apples when you're looking at the, say, 203,000 acre feet average. You would want to look at the entitlement over the time frame and average that to see how they compare. And if the entitlement's less than the upper range average, the average entitlement over that time frame is less than the average of his upper range needs, then you would say, well, they don't necessarily have enough surface supply to meet their full demands. In this particular instance, like I said, I went to a discrete year and compared this proxy 1914. I'm hesitant to say that this is a reasonable range. I think it is, given how he did the analysis and once corrected, I believe that it is the uncertainty, while probably more significant than I would have preferred, is probably within the ballpark of what the numbers would be had he done the analysis correctly from the start.
So that, I really appreciate the background and all of this, and I'm going to certainly have to sit and digest this later, but I'm trying to make sure whether I may try to pin you down on an answer to this, which is whether what I'm trying to understand here is whether these various analyses provide me with an accurate representation of how the world is or was. Right? So maybe you answered this, but humor me again. Do you think the corrected methodology provides an accurate, and by accurate, so let me back up. Let me provide some caveats for you, which is that I've noticed one of the challenges in all of our work is that engineers and scientists have a certain standard of truth, and lawyers have the preponderance of the evidence, which sometimes are very, very different things. So I'm not, you can qualify your answer as you see appropriate, but do you think that this corrected analysis, as you conducted Dr. David's analysis with your corrections in your rebuttal testimony, do you think it provides accurate information about physical facts that the State Water Board could rely on in a decision?
The corrected numbers are a lot more reliable than the uncorrected. It can always be improved, but I don't think it's going to change a lot. I believe it's within the ballpark, which I would say, given the usage, the evapotranspiration data that was originally provided, which is the data that I generated, it really is probably the best in the area. And I'm not saying that to brag. I do a lot of work down there. I know a lot about the evapotranspiration of the growing and the agronomy in the southern San Joaquin Valley. And anyways, I think it's a pretty solid number. The main mistake was the interpolation. Well, the main mistake was that to assume that if there is lower yield, there's lower evapotranspiration. Once we get rid of that assumption, then I believe if we just use the ET and within the boundaries again of current Buena Vista service areas and the zone of influence. Remember, in 1914, there was a lot more acreage to the north under a wet year that would have been irrigated or intended to irrigate. But if we just look at the constraints within that zone of influence in terms of acreage, I think it's a pretty good number, a reasonable number anyways. Again, it could be improved. It may go up or down a little bit, but it's a lot more reliable than the uncorrected information.
Thank you, Dr. Howes. I very much appreciate that, and I think that's very, very helpful. With that, I don't have any additional questions, so I think I will turn to you, Mr. Becerra, based on Mr. O'Brien's questions and then my questions. Do you have any redirect for Dr. Howes?
Yes, I do. A very limited amount.
Please go ahead.
Ms. Mullen, could we please pull up exhibit Buena Vista 503C? And can we please go to PDF page 19? Dr. House, you see your figure 9 on PDF page 19?
Yes, I do.
Are the blue shaded areas what you mean by zone of influence in your analysis?
Yes, it is. Just one note that prior to Lake Isabella, cell 3 of Buena Vista Lake at the bottom would have also been included in that.
So just for clarity of the record, on this particular figure 9, it doesn't show the entirety of Buena Vista Lake before Isabella. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And you would consider Buena Vista Lake to be in the zone of influence before Isabella. Is that right?
The entirety zone, yeah, cell 3 would have also been included in the zone of influence.
And then on this figure 9, the blue shaded boxes, oh, I'm sorry, I was going to head you the wrong way. On this figure 9, the blue shaded box labeled BVWSD appropriations upstream of Second Point, those would be places you would consider Buena Vista to have appropriated water outside of the zone of influence. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. Ms. Mullen, can we please pull up across KWBA 426? And I think it's PDF page 11. Thank you. And could we please scroll down to the middle figure on that page? Dr. Howes, do you see this figure?
Yes, I do.
And do you understand it to be a graph of California-wide alfalfa crop yields over a period of time?
Yes.
And do you see that the statewide crop yield in 1945 was approximately 4.25 tons per acre?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Ms. Mullen, can we please go to exhibit KWBA 20? And Dr. Howes, do you recognize this as the Stanton report to which you have referred?
Yes, I do.
Ms. Mullen, can we please go to PDF page 28? And Dr. Howes, do you see this table as presenting crop yields within Buena Vista specifically?
Yes, I do.
And do you understand that this report states that a Buena Vista specific crop yield in 1939 was 7.9 tons per acre?
I see that.
And it was, do you see that the crop yield for alfalfa in Buena Vista specifically was over 7 tons per acre between 1933 and 1939, except for 1935?
Yes, I see that.
And are these yields per acre all considerably higher than the 425 shown for 1945 in the preceding
Yes.
document?
Yes, they are.
And does that support your perspective that Buena Vista was perhaps unique in California for growing alfalfa at the time?
I believe that one of the main reasons that the trend is upward is that more areas similar to Buena Vista became irrigated over time, and that has, as it's reported in other other documents, that has a huge impact on that increase in yield.
Okay, thank you. I have no further redirect, Ms. Kinsey.
Thank you, Mr. Becerra. Based on that redirect, Mr. O'Brien, do you have any additional questions for Dr. House?
I have just a couple questions that are actually related to the questions that you asked, Ms. Kinsey, if I may.
So I will allow this, but I will likely, Mr. Becerra, if you want a chance for whatever we're going to call this redirect, I'll consider it. So go ahead, Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you. Ms. Mullen, if we could pull up Buena Vista 1100, which is Dr. Howe's rebuttal testimony. And go to document page 11, paragraph 27. In that paragraph 27, at the end, you make the statement that with those corrections, Dr. David's analytical framework produces a rough range of approximately 566,000 to 605,000 acre feet of 1914, I think that should be era, wet year appropriations under the second point right. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And I just want to make sure the record is clear. So in response to Ms. Kinsey's questions, you stated that that number, that range of numbers that I just read is a reasonable range for the quantification of Buena Vista's second point right. Is that a fair summary?
I don't ever remember stating a quantification of a second point right. Did I state that somewhere?
Well, that's what I'm trying to figure out. You stated that the range are pretty solid numbers, is what I wrote down. Pretty solid numbers. And I'm just
I'd say that.
Sorry, don't mean to interrupt. Go ahead, Dr. House.
Okay. I believe I said that those numbers, well, here you can see that that's the corrections and to the appropriations under Buena Vista's second point right. And I believe that if the analysis was done the way I would have done it, which would be the correct way, it would probably be within the ballpark of those numbers. So it probably within, they're probably reasonable on it for a typical wet year to an upper range appropriation under the second point right.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. Do you have any follow-up, Mr. Becerra?
I do very briefly.
Okay, please go ahead.
Ms. Mullen, can we please pull up exhibit Buena Vista 1101? And go to slide 29. Dr. Howes, you would not have used Dr. David's methodology at all to attempt to quantify the second point right. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So your testimony in Buena Vista 1105 reflects your effort to apply that methodology, but correcting some errors in it. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you did that for the areas currently within Buena Vista because that's how Dr. Davids did it. Is that right?
I explained that to Ms. Kinsey. That's right. The actual acreage was different. There was no constraint on the acreages as Dr. Davids applied here.
So looking at exhibit Buena Vista 1101, slide 29, you state that qualification. Is that accurate?
I stated here as well at the very bottom, does not account for the increase in Miller and Lux acreage irrigated past Highway 46 in the bottom left-hand corner.
Thank you, Ms. Kinsey. I have nothing further.
Thank you, Mr. Becerra, and I think it's appropriate for me to call a last chance for Mr. O'Brien. Do you, based on that limited line of questioning, do you have any additional questions for Dr. House?
I do not.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. I believe with that, we've concluded the examination of Dr. House. Dr. House, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your testimony. Thank you for working with me through my questions as well. And I appreciate you spending the time with us today.
Oh, my pleasure, Ms. Kinsey. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. O'Brien.
And
If I could unmute, thank you, Dr. House.
thank you. So it looks like it's 11:21. I suggest a brief break before we turn to your next witness, Mr. Becerra. Don't tell me. I know. Somewhere. I don't know. Oh no, here it is. Wait, I got it. Dr. Littlefield, am I right?
Yes.
Good, thank you.
Ms.
Um,
Kinsey,
yes, Mr. O'Brien.
One housekeeping matter. Mr. Bivens and I were speaking at the break, and I think we're going to have very limited and possibly no cross-examination for Ms. Melton. And I know she has a time constraint today. So I will just put that out there that if to accommodate her schedule, if you wanted to take her out of order, I don't mean to intrude on Mr. Becerra's presentation, but that's at least an option to consider.
And Ms. Kinsey, that's a very good option. Dr. Littlefield, due to some COVID concerns, is testifying remotely from where we are. So it may take him a little more time to set up. So we could perhaps get through Ms. Melton if Mr. Jacobs is agreeable.
So let's
and
turn to
break
Mr.
on.
Jacobs. Yeah, let's consider this. It may make sense, but Mr. Jacobs, I know this is a little bit of a surprise. So I'll look to you whether you think that would be appropriate and Ms. Melton would be prepared, or if you would prefer that we accommodate this a different way.
I'm texting her right now.
Okay, that's fair.
Yep, she's ready. She just needs to get on Zoom. So maybe we could take a break and she
Okay.
can get on Zoom. Okay.
Thank you. And I'll thank Ms. Melton for her flexibility and your flexibility. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 11:33 and we'll plan to hear from Ms. Melton. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ready.
Thank you. All right, we're back from our break. At this point, as we discussed before the break, I will turn to you, Mr. Jacobs. Thank you to all of you for agreeing and working with me and suggesting that we rearrange the schedule to accommodate Ms. Melton and go through this efficiently. So with that, Mr. Jacobs, are you prepared to call Ms. Melton as your first witness?
Well, I just want to make sure her video is working correctly.
Yes, let's do that.
So she needs to click start video on the bottom left corner of the screen.
And it looks like, I'm not sure what the audio
Audio is also muted. Yeah.
is also muted, and I think Ms. Melton may be calling in by phone, so. And if this doesn't work, we can accommodate a different way, but.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on.
Should we take, do you think, Mr. Jacobs, we could take, oh no, here I see Ms. Melton is, let's wait just a moment. I see an attempt to connect here. So Ms. Melton, it looks like, as far as I can tell, you're off mute, but I don't see a video feed coming through, although so if you are either able to either turn on your video through Zoom or reconnect. Mr. Jacobs, what do you think? Should we take a 5-minute break? Would you like to attempt to troubleshoot, or do you think it would be best if we turn back to Ms. Melton either later today or tomorrow?
Well, Holly, are you able to, do you have voice here?
I do have voice.
Okay.
All right.
What do you think's going on with the
I
video?
am very sorry.
That's okay. Do you have your video turned on? It's just not connected to your camera?
Apparently so. I thought that I had taken care of that.
Sometimes there's a
I can-
physical switch at the top of the screen, right by your camera, that you can slide left or
No, my
right.
camera is on. My camera is on. So it's something, and I clicked that video thing, and now it will not allow me to click off of it.
Well, let me suggest one thing, Ms. Melton. Why don't we just take a few moments? Maybe if you log out of the Zoom and log back in, sometimes that magically works. Sometimes it does not. But if you just take a minute or two to do that, and we'll see if that resolves things.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. We'll wait just a few more minutes. Looks like she was here and then logged out. We'll wait a few more minutes, and then if we can turn back to Dr. Littlefield and we can fit in Ms. Melton another time.
Ms. Kinsey, while we're waiting, I did review Ms. Melton's written testimony again over the break, and I will not have any, as soon as she sticks to her written testimony, which I'm sure she will. I will not have any cross-examination. I think maybe one option we should consider is to just move her testimony and exhibits into the record, assuming no other party would want to cross-examine her.
Agree to that, sure.
Are there any other, then I'll ask, are there any other parties who would have questions for Ms. Melton?
North Kern has none.
Thank you.
Buena Vista does not.
Thank you.
Kern Delta Water District does not.
Bakersfield does not.
Thank you. So it sounds like what we can do, if it works for you, Mr. Jacobs, is we could, I think it would be appropriate to have Ms. Melton just confirm. I could, well, she signed her testimony, but we could just confirm orally that this is a true and correct copy, and then we'll move it into the record once with the rest of the KCWA exhibits. Would that work for you?
So you would like her to, if we can't get the video, just to voice that it's a true and correct copy?
Yes, I'll administer the oath. We won't have it on video, but I can administer the oath orally with audio only, and then confirm that this is a true and correct copy and go from there, unless there are any objections from any other party with that approach.
Her testimony is KCWA 31.
Thank you. So Ms. Melton, can you hear me, and will you just confirm that I can hear you? Will you please?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you. And we don't have you on video, but I will administer the oath. Will you please, in your location, raise your right hand? Ms. Melton, do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. And with that, I'll turn things over to you, Mr. Jacobs. Please go ahead.
Ms. Melton, is KCWA 31 a true and correct copy of your rebuttal testimony in this phase 1B?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And did you also submit KCWA 26 through 30 as exhibits in this matter?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And as well as KCWA 25, which is the collection of the two exchange agreements between KCWA, the Kern County Water Agency, and Tulare Lake Basin Water Storage District.
Yes, I did.
Okay, and with that, I would request that we move those exhibits into the evidence.
Let's hold on that just because so I can orient myself. Let's do that all together in terms of moving them into evidence. It's probably a sensible time, but let's just wait so I can write it all down in the same place. But with that, Mr. Jacobs, do you have any other questions for Ms. Melton at this time, or does that complete her oral appearance today?
I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And I had confirmed previously with the parties that they have no cross-examination for Ms. Melton. So Ms. Melton, I do want to thank you for your written testimony and for joining us today. I'm sorry we couldn't see you on camera, but I'm sure we will see you next time. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, and I apologize.
With that, it is now 11:44. Mr. Becerra, do you do you think it makes sense for us to turn to Dr. Littlefield's summary of his written testimony now, or would you prefer to do this all at once after a lunch break?
If I can have 5 minutes to get a hold of him on the phone, I asked him to stand down, and
Right,
now
I
I need
know.
to see if he can come back. Let me see if I can get a hold of him on the phone.
Okay, let's just take, I'm going to turn off my video for 5 minutes and we'll be back at 11:50.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Kinsey, do you want to proceed?
I'm watching Dr. Littlefield's, the icon says he's connecting to audio. So that's what I was sitting here waiting for. What do you think, Mr. Becerra? You spoke with Dr. Littlefield. Would you like to go ahead with his summary now?
Yes, he's
Assuming that,
ready to go,
assuming that he can connect. I don't know if,
assuming he can connect.
yes. And it may be Zoom. Sometimes, I don't know. Zoom has a mind of its own. I see Dr. Littlefield, so I think I will, I guess what I'll do formally is I'll turn to you, Mr. Becerra. Are you prepared to call your next witness at this time?
Yes, Buena Vista Water Storage District calls Dr. Doug Littlefield.
Dr. Littlefield, if you would, first of all, good morning. It's still morning. And if you would please go off mute and I will administer the oath. Thank
Good
you.
morning, Ms. Kinsey.
Thank you. It's good to see you again. Will you please raise your right hand? Dr. Littlefield, do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the truth that, excuse me, Dr. Littlefield, do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. You may proceed, Mr. Becerra.
Thank you. Dr. Littlefield, can you please state your name for the record?
Yes, my name is Douglas R. Littlefield.
And Dr. Littlefield, have you previously submitted your statement of qualifications in this hearing?
I have.
Is Exhibit Buena Vista 900 your written rebuttal testimony?
Yes, it is.
Is Exhibit, and do you have any typographical errors to correct in that testimony?
Yes, I do have one typographical error. Let's see, on page 17 of my written rebuttal testimony, my reference to Buena Vista 913 at pages 7 to 8 is incorrect. It should be Buena Vista 912 at pages 7 to 8.
Thank you. Is Exhibit Buena Vista 901 your summary of your testimony?
That's correct.
And Ms. Mullen, could we please pull up Buena Vista 901? Dr. Littlefield, our exhibits Buena Vista 902 through Buena Vista 926, the exhibits to your written rebuttal testimony?
They are.
And Ms. Kinsey, we've allocated Dr. Littlefield 20 minutes of our 80 minutes.
Thank you.
Dr. Littlefield, using Exhibit Buena Vista 901, can you please summarize your written testimony?
Yes. First, I want to note that I'm testifying remotely from my office in Oakland due to COVID concerns. So if any technical problems emerge, I apologize in advance. I'd also like to note that it was extremely hot here yesterday and already is going pretty hot here. And I do not have air conditioning, which is why I'm foregoing the suit coat today. It's close to 85 now in my office here, so I'm hoping it doesn't get too much hotter.
Thank you, Dr. Littlefield. I just say I completely understand. And throughout your time testifying, if you need to take breaks, especially in cross, please let us know that the heat is real. So I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much. I might occasionally also look to my left during the testimony because I have a much larger monitor there. So if we have an exhibit, it's perhaps easier for me to see it there. So with that said, this is a brief overview of the material covered in my complete written rebuttal testimony, which is dated May 22nd, 2022. And if I could have the next slide, please. And my rebuttal testimony addresses two conclusions that are set forth in Dr. Scott Miltenberger's written testimony. And this slide shows those conclusions. In general, Dr. Miltenberger argues that Miller and Lux did not significantly change its ranching or water uses from the late 19th century into the early 20th century. And the other point that he argues is that Miller and Lux had no organized plans before 1914 to develop its water resources beyond just cattle ranching. Next slide, please. The complete historical record, however, shows that Dr. Miltenberger is incorrect for three reasons. First, Dr. Miltenberger did not consider the complete case file for the California Supreme Court's decision in Title Insurance and Trust Company versus Miller and Lux, which is a 1920 case from the California Supreme Court. And that includes the lower court transcripts and various other documents. Secondly, Dr. Miltenberger did not sufficiently review the major portions of the Bancroft Library's Miller and Lux collection, which is held at the University of California at Berkeley. And third, Dr. Miltenberger did not consider important details in the overall historical context or the overall historical context of three major reports describing Miller and Lux's water rights and uses. Those three reports are Walter Mendenhall's preliminary report on the groundwaters of the San Joaquin Valley, which is USGS Water Supply Paper 222 and was published in 1908. And the second one is Walter Mendenhall's Groundwater in the San Joaquin Valley, California, which is USGS Water Supply Paper 398, published in 1916. Dr. Miltenberger also did not consider the context or many of the details behind Joseph B. Lippincott and Thomas Means' quote, report on the Miller and Lux Ranch, Southern Division on the Kern River, California. And that's an unpublished manuscript at the Water Resources Center archives at the University of California at Riverside. That's a 1919 report. If Dr. Miltenberger had considered these other materials, his conclusions might have been considerably different. And the details about these shortcomings are going to be explained in the following slides. So if I could have the next slide, please. First of all, Dr. Miltenberger did not review the entire title insurance case file. The complete case file is the lower court proceedings in the title insurance case, and it's central to understanding Miller and Lux's water rights and uses and plans under the 1888 Miller-Hagen Agreement, and that's for two important reasons. First, the case centered on second point water rights, and the lower court proceedings began in 1913 and ended in 1915. And that means that the trial overlapped December 19th, 1914, which is when the Water Commission Act took place. A second reason why the title insurance case file is important is that it contains testimony by top-ranking Miller and Lux employees about water rights and uses for several decades after the 1888 Miller-Hagen Agreement. Those employees included J. Leroy Nickel, who was Henry Miller's son-in-law and eventually the president of Miller and Lux, C.Z. Merritt, who was Miller and Lux's office manager who oversaw regional Miller and Lux operations, including the Buena Vista Water Storage District area, and James Ogden, who is Miller and Lux's superintendent of the Buttonwillow Ranch. The case file also includes various important documents, including deeds, agreements, correspondence, reports, and other vital records, which are, for the most part, reproduced verbatim. All of these things relate specifically to Miller and Lux's water rights and water uses after improvements had been made to Buena Vista Lake Reservoir under the terms of the 1888 Miller-Hagen Agreement. And all of this information demonstrates that Miller and Lux changed its water uses during the late 19th and early 20th centuries and developed plans to use its water resources prior to 1914 in a coordinated and managed manner that included storage of Buena Vista Lake Reservoir. Next slide, please. Similar to the title insurance and trust company case file, Dr. Miltenberger did not consider the full Miller and Lux collection at the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley. The case file, as my written rebuttal testimony indicates, is enormous, and it covers all aspects of the company's business, including the Buena Vista Water Storage District area. And Dr. Miltenberger's uses of the Miller and Lux collection he does have some, but they do not address how the company developed a business model to maximize its water rights and uses, and how that model changed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to include, for example, crop diversification. The Miller and Lux collection illustrates that with more reliable water supplies available due to the structures built under the terms of the 1888 Miller-Hagen Agreement, Miller and Lux began diversifying crops by the early 1900s. The structures that I'm talking about here include the East Levee, the North Levee, Coles Levee, the Inlet Canal, the Outlet Canal, all of which related to Buena Vista Lake Reservoir and storage in that particular facility. Documents from the Miller and Lux collection show that with the improvements brought about by the Miller-Hagen Agreement, including those that I just listed, Miller and Lux began farming corn in the what is now the Buena Vista Water Storage District in 1904. And for example, James Ogden noted that tenant farmers were harvesting 20,000 sacks of corn on Miller and Lux's lands. And while I'm not an agricultural expert, that would, to me, would seem like it probably covered a considerable amount of area to grow that much corn. Miller and Lux also began raising carrots and sugar beets and pumpkins in the teens. They also grew potatoes, beans, and Milo maize by the early 1920s. And in addition to this, they provided water to tenant farmers who also grew diverse crops, including thousands of acres of sugar beets. In fact, one of Miller and Lux's employees at what is now the Buena Vista Water Storage District noted that in 1916, Miller and Lux's tenants were intended to grow 9,000 acres of sugar beets in what is today Buena Vista Water Storage District. And in addition to that, Miller and Lux also began building the town of Buttonwillow with better water management that was brought about by the 1888 Miller-Hagen Agreement, including storage at Buena Vista Lake Reservoir. And in fact, contrary to Dr. Miltenberger's conclusion that Buena Vista Lake Reservoir was only minimally useful, the historical record shows just the opposite. It defies logic to suggest Miller and Lux did not see Buena Vista Lake Reservoir as improved by the requirements of the 1888 Miller-Hagen Agreement as being highly useful. Predecessors to Miller and Lux used the reservoir, including Thomas Baker, the founder of Bakersfield. Miller and Lux also used the reservoir. And not only that, but also the Buena Vista Water Storage District continued to use the reservoir until the 1950s when Lake Isabella supplanted that storage facility. Next slide, please. Dr. Miltenberger also did not consider, as I indicated earlier, two important published reports by the U.S. Geological Survey's Mendenhall. One published in 1908 and the other in 1916. This slide, which is a map from the 1908 Mendenhall report, shows areas where the Geological Survey had mapped groundwater accessibility before 1908. And this is a demonstration of part of the historical record that shows Miller and Lux began incorporating groundwater management into its overall water management plan. On this slide, the superimposed red circles show the groundwater underlay the areas of the Buttonwillow service area. That's the oval on the left-hand side. And under the Maples service area, that's on the right. And the groundwater I'm referring to there is the very darker shade of gray. And if I could have the next slide, please. And Dr. Miltenberger also did not consider the 1916 Mendenhall report and how it demonstrated that Miller and Lux was also relying on groundwater as early as 1905. When the two reports, the 1908 Mendenhall report and the 1916 Mendenhall report, are considered together, it clearly shows that the Miller and Lux intended to use the wells that Mendenhall discussed in 1908. That Miller and Lux was using those wells before 1905 and were continuing to use them as of 1916. This particular slide shows a page from a multi-page table in Mendenhall's 1916 report listing wells in the vicinity of Miller and Lux's Buttonwillow Ranch, and those are highlighted in green here. And although the Miller and Lux wells themselves don't show any specific dates for when they were completed, it's important to note that Mendenhall wrote that all of these wells had been completed before 1905, and that's a statement from his 1908 report. In addition, many of the other wells near Miller and Lux, clearly, if you look at the table's dates that are provided here, had been completed, some of them even as early as the 1890s. When the 1916 tables are examined specifically in reference to just Miller and Lux's lands within today's Button Willow service area, the table shows that there were at least 4 wells providing water for domestic and stock watering and irrigation purposes. Maybe the next slide, please. This is a slide from Mendenhall's 1916 report, and it illustrates wells at what became the Buena Vista Water Storage District as early as 1905. Those are in the light blue boxes. The left-hand box shows wells as in the Button Willow service area, and the right-hand box shows the wells in the Maple service area. And thus, by not consulting Mendenhall studies, Dr. Miltenberger did not acknowledge that Miller and Lux began integrating groundwater resources into their overall water management plan that not only included not the groundwater, but of course, surface flows and storage at Buena Vista Lake Reservoir. I could have the next slide, please. Like the Mendenhall reports and the title insurance case and the Miller and Lux papers, Dr. Miltenberger also did not consider the full context of the 1919 Lippincott Means report. He did not dig deeply enough into the background of the 1919 report. And when you look at a full assessment of the context of that report, it shows, including this table, it shows considerable detail about what Miller and Lux intended to do with their better managed water resources. This is a table that comes from the 1919 report. There's been a lot of discussion about this previously. In this particular table, I've highlighted in green Miller and Lux wells that were identified as having been in use for domestic irrigation and stock watering purposes as of 19 in the vicinity of the Buena Vista Water Storage District. And to really understand the context of this table and the full report, you need to look at, for example, the cover letter that was addressed to Lippincott conveying the report, and that particular cover letter had been indicated that the report had been requested by an individual by the name of Percy H. Clark. Looking a little further into that background, Percy Clark headed a major real estate and marketing company at the time. And not only that, but he also served on the board of directors of the Kern Valley Reclamation Company, which is not the Kern Valley Water Company. The Kern Valley Reclamation Company was essentially a Miller and Lux subsidiary. And by looking at the articles of incorporation of that company, you can see that, for example, all of the members of the board of directors of the Kern Valley Reclamation Company had direct ties to Miller and Lux. The articles of incorporation, moreover, stated that the company would plan to extend Miller and Lux's canal system to north of Wasco Road. Apparently Clark had been asked by Lippincott and Means, as this report demonstrates, for the proposal about how Miller and Lux might do that. So in order to develop water supplies for all of Miller and Lux's lands, including both north and south of Wasco Road. Cumulatively, this was an area of about 125,000 acres. As a result, the Lippincott Means report proposed 2 particular components of an overall plan. The first one was to provide water supplies to the title insurance and trust company lands, which I should note at this particular point, the case was being appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. So this would be a possible solution short of waiting for the final decision. And the Lippincott Means report also provided a plan to show how reliable water could be provided to all of Miller and Lux's lands, both north and south of Wasco Road, in order to allow Miller and Lux to begin selling that land, which they started doing shortly after Henry Miller had died in 1916. So to accomplish this goal, the Miller and Lippincott Means report proposed taking all of Miller and Lux's second point surface water to the lands north of Wasco Road, or providing land south of Wasco Road with water supplies from groundwater wells. And these were wells that were listed in the table and could be seen in the Mendenhall 2 reports. Anyway, the table was to illustrate that there was sufficient groundwater in the Miller and Lux as well as south of Wasco Road to cover these objectives. But Dr. Miltenberger completely ignored this entire background to this report, which helps explain its significance in relation to Buena Vista Water Storage District. If I could have the next slide, please. Dr. Miltenberger also ignored a lot of the visual evidence in the 1919 Lippincott Means report, including this particular map. This map shows where the wells listed in the table on the previous slide were located in relation to the future Buttonwillow service area. The wells in this map are shown as black dots with numbers next to them, and the wells are the same ones that are on the table. When you compare numbers, you can see that they are the exact same ones. So according to the Lippincott Means report's proposal, wells would serve Miller and Lux's land south of Wasco Road, as you can see in this close-up of the Buttonwillow service area. And surface flows were then proposed to be carried north of Wasco Road through the Kern Valley Reclamation Company canal extensions of Miller and Lux's previous water system. With this kind of a water management plan, the Lippincott Means report intended to use all of the water resources of the area, including storage at Buena Vista Lake Reservoir, surface flows under the second point right, and groundwater supplies to serve all of Miller and Lux's lands, including both north and south of Wasco Road. Next slide, please. This is a close-up. I should point out the previous slide was a close-up of a part of the map in the 1919 Lippincott Means report. This is a close-up of another part of the map showing the future Maples service area. And it also shows wells in relation to the Maples service area. The 1919 Lippincott Means report became the basis for the 1923 proposal for the Buena Vista Water Storage District. And in fact, if one consults the 1919 Lippincott Means report, the report specifically says that part of its objective is to provide data and information necessary for creating a district that would encompass all of Miller and Lux's lands. The original proposal was for a district that would serve about 125,000 acres, including both north and south of Wasco Road. But as I testified in my direct testimony, the 1923 proposal that grew out of the Lippincott Means report was reduced in area after review by California's water authorities. Those authorities believed there was not sufficient reliable surface flows to serve all of the lands north of Wasco Road. And the result was that the 1923 plan was then revised in 1924 to limit all of the available water supplies to areas just south of Wasco Road. So the new revised plan included taking all of the surface flows that had been under Lippincott Means intended to go north of Wasco Road and to combine them with storage supplies and groundwater south of Wasco Road to serve what is essentially today the Buena Vista Water Storage District. Today, the plan continues to include all of these supplies as in general first outlined by Lippincott Means, but then subsequently reduced by state authorities. Can I have the last slide, please? So to summarize, Dr. Miltenberger's conclusions are incorrect because his written testimony did not discuss major parts of the historical record regarding Miller and Lux's operations in the vicinity of what is today the Buena Vista Water Storage District. He did not thoroughly take a look at the Title Insurance and Trust Company case file. He did not examine major parts of the Miller and Lux collection at the Bancroft Library. He did not he did not use at all any of the Mendenhall reports of 1908 and 1916. And the third report, that the Lippincott Means Report, although Dr. Miltenberger did consult it, he did not look deeply enough into its background to understand its real purpose and how it fit into the overall plans for Miller and Lux and how that related to today's Buena Vista Water Storage District. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Littlefield. Mr. Becerra, do you have any other questions for your witness at this time?
I do not.
So I think what we should do is break for lunch and then for an hour and then come back and start with cross-examination. Is there anything we should address before we take our lunch break? All right, thank you, Dr. Littlefield, for getting us started. Let's go ahead and break until 1:15. I will see all of you then. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
We need to all log off and then log back on, correct?
Yes, please. Please, everyone log off or you will be removed and then log back in using the same link. Thank you.
Thank you.